Imagine standing in a carver's studio in southeast Alaska.
Oh, that is such a vivid image to start with.
Right. The very first thing that hits you is the smell. It's this sharp, sweet, almost citrusy scent of wet red cedar.
Yeah, you can almost smell it just talking about it.
You look over, and there's a massive, half-finished log resting on these heavy wooden trestles. And the carver is working with an adze.
Which is a traditional hand tool, right?
Yeah.
With a D-shaped handle and a curved blade.
Exactly. And the strokes are just so rhythmic. Thwack, thwack, thwack.
A constant, steady beat.
And the wood chips are quietly piling up around their feet, leaving this, beautiful textured pattern on the wood itself.
It's incredible to watch.
It really is. It is the smell and the sound of a wealthy, highly advanced, monumental civilization.
Absolutely.
But here is the catch. The central mystery that the compiler of today's deep dive brought to us. To build this magnificent civilization, to feed full-time artists, to erect 60-foot monuments.
And to engineer these really complex social hierarchies.
Right. To do all of that, these people never planted a single seed.
Not one.
No agriculture, no plows, no farms.
It completely shatters the standard historical rulebook. I mean, most of us are taught from grade school that if a human population wants to build a complex society...
With monumental architecture and specialized artisans.
Right, you absolutely must invent agriculture. You need to domesticate wheat or corn or rice to create a food surplus.
But the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast achieved all of that entirely as hunter-fisher-gatherers.
Which is just wild to think about.
And their method of handling that immense surplus they gathered from the wild, that is the absolute center of our deep dive mission today.
It's a huge topic.
It is. The compiler of today's deep dive into the source material handed us an incredible, dense stack of sources.
Yeah, we're talking anthropological field notes, oral histories preserved by indigenous elders.
Plus the actual historical logs kept by colonial agents and missionaries.
And modern economic analyses of pre-contact indigenous economies. Exactly.
And our goal is to take all of that and basically analyze the potlatch.
We're not just going to look at it as some quaint cultural festival, or a religious ceremony.
No, we are going to examine it as a highly functioning, deeply complex, and incredibly rational economic system.
It's a radical philosophy, really, an entire society organizing itself around the idea that social status and political power are won by giving your wealth away.
Rather than hoarding it.
Right, which is an incredible premise. It is a direct inversion of almost every fundamental assumption modern capitalism makes about human nature.
And status, and the accumulation of wealth.
Exactly.
Now, before we really get into the mechanics of this, I want to leave a quick note for you, the listener.
This is really important context.
Because the sources we are looking at paint a truly complete, unfiltered picture today. We are going to be exploring some deeply complex and sometimes very harsh historical realities.
Yeah, we'll be looking at the undeniable beauty of these indigenous cultural practices, but also at the devastating impacts of colonial assimilation policies.
Right. At the same time, the historical records and modern scholarship demand that we examine the pre-contact realities of strict, rigid social hierarchies and chattel slavery.
We have to look at the whole picture.
And our goal here is total impartiality. We aren't taking political sides, and we aren't here to moralize.
No, not at all.
We are simply going to impartially report the documented history and the contested scholarship found in our sources.
Aiming only to help you understand these incredibly complex, multifaceted, and very much living cultures.
I think that's a vital framework. Because if you want to genuinely understand the scale of what abundance actually builds in human societies,
you have to be willing to look at the entire ledger.
The masterpieces and the hierarchies alike. They grew from the exact same soil.
They really did.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at the sheer, staggering ecological reality of the Pacific Northwest.
Because none of this economic theory matters if you don't understand the geography.
Exactly. I want you to imagine living in a city where the grocery stores are completely free. You can take whatever you want as much as you want.
Sounds like a dream.
Right. But there's a massive catch. The stores are only open for 3 or 4 weeks out of the entire year.
Oh, wow.
How does that fundamentally dictate how you spend the other 11 months?
I mean, it dictates everything. And it's the perfect analogy for the temperate rainforest coast.
It really is.
We are talking about a massive, incredibly rich, but very specific geography. It spans from the rugged shores of Oregon up through the fjords and islands of British Columbia.
And all the way into southeast Alaska.
Right. This is the ancestral and current home of incredibly diverse and distinct peoples. The sources highlight The Tlingit, the Haida, the Tsimshian, the
The
Nizhga.
Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuchanolth, the Coast Salish, among many others.
Yeah, they all have distinct languages and customs, but they all built their civilizations on the foundation of a localized ecological miracle.
The sources refer to it as a double abundance.
Yes, that's a great term for it.
And the primary engine of that abundance, the first half of it, is the marine surplus, specifically the Pacific salmon.
The salmon is everything.
But I actually struggled to understand this part of the sources at first. How is fishing for salmon different from, say, hunting deer or gathering berries?
That's a really good question.
Why does it create a civilization-altering surplus?
Well, it comes down to the biology and the life cycle of the Pacific salmon. There are 5 main species, Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum.
Okay.
And they are anadromous, meaning they're born in freshwater streams. They migrate out to the open ocean to mature and gain massive amounts of body mass.
Right.
And then at the end of their lives, they return to the exact same freshwater streams to spawn and die.
So they were essentially importing millions of calories from the deep ocean directly into the rivers.
Right, to people's front doors, exactly. And the crucial factor is predictability.
They aren't just like swimming by randomly.
No, they don't just trickle in randomly throughout the year. They arrive in massive, dense, highly predictable pulses.
So you know exactly when they're coming.
Yes. A specific river might see hundreds of thousands of sockeye salmon push up its current over the course of just a few weeks in the late summer or early fall.
But knowing they are coming is one thing. Actually catching enough of them to feed thousands of people for a year without modern industrial trawlers.
That's another story entirely.
How did they actually harvest this pulse?
Through brilliant, highly localized engineering.
Okay, tell me about that.
Because these communities owned and strictly managed their specific fishing sites as hereditary property, they knew the hydrology of their rivers intimately.
So they weren't just guessing where to fish.
Not at all. They built sophisticated weirs.
Let's think through the mechanics of that. What exactly is a weir in this context?
Think of it as a permeable underwater fence, usually constructed from cedar poles and woven lattice, driven right into the riverbed.
Okay, so it blocks the fish, but not the water.
Exactly. It doesn't stop the flow of water, which would destroy the weir, but it creates a physical barrier for the migrating fish.
That is so smart.
The weir is designed to funnel the salmon into specific, narrow openings, and those openings lead into traps or into shallow holding pools where fishermen stand on platforms.
With specialized dip nets and gaffs.
Right. It is essentially an industrial harvesting bottleneck. With a well-engineered weir, a community could secure a massive share of their entire year's protein and fat requirements in a matter of weeks.
That's just mind-blowing. And the salmon wasn't the only thing coming out of the water.
Oh, no. The sources detail halibut fishing, the hunting of sea mammals like seals and whales.
And the gathering of shellfish. But there is one specific fascinating little fish I want to talk about. The eulachon.
Oh, the eulachon is incredible. It's often called the candlefish.
Right. The sources say it is so incredibly rich in oil that if you dry it, you can literally run a wick through it and light it on fire like a candle.
It literally burns.
That is wild.
Yes, and while that's a fascinating party trick, its real value was nutritional and economic. These communities would harvest millions of eulachon in the spring. But they didn't just eat them whole. They engaged in a complex, multi-day industrial rendering process.
To get the oil out.
Right. They would let the fish decompose slightly in massive wooden vats to break down the cellular structure.
Okay, a little gross, but very effective.
Then they would introduce boiling water, heated by dropping red-hot rocks into the vats to separate the oil.
Oh, wow. Hot rocks straight into the vat.
Yeah, and then they would skim that oil off the top.
Eulachon grease.
Precisely. Eulachon grease was the butter, the olive oil, and the vitamin supplement of the Northwest coast.
It was like liquid gold.
It was highly prized, nutritionally dense winter fat, and it became a vital, extremely lucrative trade good that moved along ancient grease trails deep into the interior of the continent.
Okay, so you have this unbelievable bounty of protein and fat from the salmon and the eulachon. But getting all this food out of the water is only step one. I go back to the grocery store analogy. If you buy a year's worth of groceries in 3 weeks, most of it is going to rot before you can eat it.
Unless you have a way to save it.
The real technological leap here has to be preservation.
Without preservation, the surplus is meaningless. So they mastered industrial-scale processing.
How did they do it?
The moment the salmon were pulled from the weir, it triggered an all-hands-on-deck community effort. The fish were expertly cleaned, filleted, and hung in massive, specialized smokehouses.
And they are using alderwood smoke,
Yep.
right? And the ambient wind to slowly draw the moisture out of the flesh.
Correct. By drying and smoking the salmon, they arrested the bacterial decay. They literally banked those calories for the long term.
So it wouldn't spoil.
A dried salmon can last for years if stored properly.
So that is the marine half of the double abundance, the calories. But you can't build a house out of dried fish.
No, you definitely cannot.
The other half of the abundance is arboreal. It's the forest, specifically the western red cedar.
If the salmon is the fuel, the western red cedar is the physical infrastructure of this civilization.
It's just a miracle tree.
It is essentially the perfect material for a temperate rainforest environment. It grows exceptionally tall and massive.
And it has some unique properties, right?
Yes, it is naturally infused with oils that make it highly rot resistant, which is vital when it rains constantly.
And it has a very specific grain. The sources really emphasize how straight it grows.
Yes, the straight grain is its superpower. Because it grows so straight, indigenous engineers could use wedges made of bone, antler, or harder woods like yew to split massive uniform planks directly off a felled log.
Wait, really? Just splitting them off?
Yes, or even off a living tree without killing it. They didn't need metal saws to create lumber.
Wait. They were harvesting planks from living trees.
Absolutely. Culturally modified trees are still visible in the forests today.
That is astonishing.
You can see the ancient scars where a master carpenter carefully wedged off a massive plank and the tree just healed over the wound and kept growing.
That is just brilliant sustainability. And what are they doing with these planks?
They are building cities of wood. They constructed massive plank longhouses.
So these aren't just little cabins.
We aren't talking about temporary huts, no. We are talking about permanent multifamily dwellings that could be 60 or 100 feet long, supported by massive carved house posts.
The cedar didn't just provide the walls, though. The sources say they could also steam the wood to change its physical properties.
This is a technique called kerfing.
Kerfing, okay.
They would take a single flat cedar plank, carve precise grooves or kerfs into it, and then steam the wood until it became pliable.
And then what? Bend it.
Then they would literally fold the wood into a box shape, sewing the final corner together with spruce root.
Wow.
These bentwood boxes were watertight. They were used for cooking, for storing that eulachon grease, and for protecting ceremonial regalia.
And the sheer versatility doesn't end there. They carved massive seagoing canoes from single cedar logs.
Vessels capable of carrying dozens of people and tons of cargo across the open ocean for trade, warfare, and whaling.
And they even used the bark.
The inner bark of the cedar is incredibly fibrous. Women would harvest strips of it, pound it, and shred it until it became as soft as cotton.
To make clothing.
Yes, they wove it into waterproof capes, skirts, mats, and heavily insulated blankets.
Okay, so you have the salmon providing an immense reliable calorie bank.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the cedar providing permanent shelter, transportation, and clothing.
Right.
But when I was reading the economic analyses and the sources, the real magic equation, the thing that totally blew my mind, is how those two things combine to create something invisible.
They convert calories and wood into time. If we connect this to the bigger picture, time is the ultimate currency of human development.
Exactly.
When anthropologists and economists talk about abundance in historical terms, they are really talking about an energy surplus that secures a society's survival so efficiently that it liberates human time.
Let's break that down because it's so counterintuitive. We usually think of hunter-gatherers as constantly struggling to survive, foraging from dawn to dusk.
That's a profound misconception regarding the Northwest Coast.
Why is that?
Because they could gather, process, and store all their necessary food so rapidly during the summer and fall runs. The dark, wet winter months were almost entirely free from the burden of subsistence labor.
That's wild.
Modern studies have suggested they actually spent significantly less time working to feed themselves than a typical European agricultural farming village of the same era.
So let me get this straight. You have an entire population of thousands of people living in massive, warm cedar longhouses.
Right.
With pantries literally overflowing with smoked salmon and eulachon grease.
Yep.
And they have absolutely nothing they have to do to survive for the next 5 months.
And that freed-up winter is the blank canvas for everything that follows.
You know that phase, the blank canvas.
When a society has a guaranteed food supply banked away and months of uninterrupted free time, they have the opportunity to transform those extra calories into cultural capital. they can specialize.
Which brings us to what they actually did with that time. The sources refer to these societies during this season as the winter people.
The winter was the sacred season. It was the season of creation, of law, and of ceremony.
Because everyone is inside.
With the grueling outdoor subsistence work finished, the focus shifted entirely indoors into the firelight of those master-carved cedar plank longhouses.
And this is when the artists get to work.
This was when the society's full-time specialists, the artists, the carvers, the spiritual leaders, the historians went to work.
Let's talk about the art, because the level of mechanical and aesthetic complexity is staggering. The sources highlight the articulated transformation masks.
Yes.
These are most strongly associated with the Kwakwaka'wakw people.
The transformation masks are masterpieces of both sculpture and engineering.
Imagine sitting in a longhouse. The only light is from the central fire pit, casting huge, flickering shadows on the cedar walls.
It must have been so atmospheric.
Right. A dancer steps out wearing this massive, beautifully carved wooden mask of a raven, or maybe an eagle.
And they are moving to the beat of wooden drums.
And then at the climax of the dance, the dancer pulls a hidden system of strings.
This is the best part.
The mask literally splits open on hinges, folding back to reveal an entirely different face inside, often the face of a human ancestor.
It is pure theatrical genius. These winter ceremonials were not just casual dances. They were immersive, highly produced, months-long events.
Like a full-scale production.
Yes. They used dramatic lighting techniques, trapping embers to create sparks. They used trap doors dug into the dirt floors of the longhouses so dancers could seemingly vanish or appear from the earth.
Trap doors. That is amazing.
They had hidden assistants using kelp tubes like speaking trumpets to make spirit voices echo from the darkest corners of the roof.
It sounds exactly like a modern stage production. But the sources are very clear that this wasn't just entertainment.
Absolutely not. It was highly staged theater, yes, but its purpose was entirely serious and foundational to the society.
What was the purpose?
It was about manifesting myth into reality. It was about affirming the specific supernatural origins of a lineage.
Okay, so it's tied to their identity?
And validating the social rank and the hereditary rights of the chiefs who hosted the ceremonies.
And the sheer, unadulterated labor that went into the regalia worn during these ceremonies. I mean, the Chilkat weaving is a perfect example of this.
Chilkat weaving is one of the most complex textile arts in the world.
These are stunning, heavy ceremonial robes worn by high-ranking individuals. They feature complex, curvilinear designs, often depicting animal crests like bears or killer whales.
And they are woven from mountain goat wool spun over a core of shredded cedar bark.
But it's the time investment that's hard to fathom. The technique is so intricate, so mathematically demanding, that a single robe could take a master weaver nearly a year to complete.
A year of continuous, highly skilled labor devoted to a single garment. Think about the economic implications of that.
It's staggering.
That is the clearest possible evidence of a massive societal surplus. You cannot have an individual spend a year weaving a single robe unless the society has enough banked salmon to feed her, shelter her, and provide for her family while she does it.
So the robe is essentially crystallized salmon calories.
Exactly.
But the most recognizable symbol of this free time, and easily the most misunderstood by outsiders, is the totem pole.
Oh, the mythology surrounding totem poles is incredibly persistent.
Largely due to early colonial misinterpretations.
Right. The primary myth we need to completely deconstruct right now is that these were religious idols meant to be worshipped.
Right. Early missionaries saw tall wooden carvings of animals and just immediately assumed they were pagan gods.
They were absolutely not objects of worship. Nobody was praying to a totem pole.
I think the best way to understand them is to think about our own legal systems.
Okay, how so?
Think about how we record a deed to a house, or a marriage certificate, or a highly negotiated business contract. We type it up on paper, we get a notary public to stamp it with a seal, and we lock it away in a dark filing cabinet in a county clerk's office.
That's how we do it, yeah.
For the indigenous nations of the Northwest Coast, the legal document isn't hidden in a drawer. It is a 60-foot log, standing in the rain, visibly declaring a family's history, their territorial ownership, and their legal rights to everyone who walks or paddles by.
That is a brilliant translation of their function. They are literally pages of legal code carved in cedar.
Legal code in cedar, I like that.
When you look at the figures stacked vertically up the pole, the raven, the eagle, the bear, the killer whale, the human figures, you are looking at crests.
And these crests act like a European coat of arms.
Yes, but with far more immediate legal weight. A coat of arms might just be a symbol of a family name. A carved crest on a pole declares precisely whose house it stands in front of, what specific exclusive lineage lives there.
And what resource territories they own.
Exactly. And what foundational myths give them the right to hold those titles? It is a public material charter of rights.
So when we look at the intricate, stylized painting on a longhouse front, or the mechanical complexity of a transformation mask, or a towering cedar pole, we shouldn't just see beautiful art.
No, we are looking at a financial and legal transaction.
The art and the architecture are the visible, permanent spending of an invisible, perishable surplus.
That's exactly it. The banked salmon is the budget. The cedar pole is the purchase.
It is the material manifestation of their wealth, which forces us to ask the core question of the sources. Once you have all this wealth, this undeniable recurring abundance of food and time and monumental art, what do you actually do with it?
How do you organize the psychology of a society around it?
And that leads us to the heart of the deep dive, the potlatch. We're going to dive deeply into the potlatch, not just as a cultural festival or a party, but as a serious, highly coherent, mathematically rigid economic system.
Because their approach to wealth is so fundamentally alien to ours.
Here's where it gets really interesting. In much of the world, historically and today, a recurring agricultural or industrial surplus leads directly to elite hoarding.
The philosophy is incredibly simple, and we live with it today. Wealth is the pile of resources you sit on.
Right. It's the grain locked in your silo, the gold stacked in your vault, the zeros in your bank account.
Your power comes directly from what you accumulate and withhold from others.
But on the Northwest coast, they inverted the hoard. A chief did not build his name, his status, or his political power by locking his wealth away in a cedar box.
No, he built his status by publicly, lavishly, and competitively giving everything away.
The potlatch is the engine of this alternative economy. The word itself comes from the Chinook jargon, a trade language used along the coast.
And it simply means to give.
Let's walk through the exact mechanics of how a potlatch actually worked. Because it wasn't just a spontaneous act of generosity, right? It was triggered by specific legal or social requirements.
Correct. A potlatch was not a random party. It was a formal, highly structured event summoned for moments that required public legal witnessing.
What kind of moments?
Say, a chief taking on a new hereditary title after the death of a predecessor, or a major marriage between two powerful lineages.
Or raising one of those memorial totem poles.
Yes, or the formal passing of specific rites, dances, or names to a chosen heir. None of these events were considered legally binding or socially recognized until a potlatch was held to validate them.
So the host lineage, the family making the claim, would summon guests. And they wouldn't just invite their friends.
Oh, no. They would invite guests from rival lineages and sometimes delegations from entirely different villages or nations.
Paddling for days in those massive cedar canoes just to attend.
And when the guests arrived, the host's job was to overwhelm them with abundance. They were hosted on a massive scale.
We're talking days or weeks of feasting.
They were fed lavishly with the finest foods, the best cuts of salmon, the richest eulachon grease, berries preserved in oil.
And they were entertained with those theatrical winter dances we discussed.
Showing off the host's exclusive ceremonial prerogatives, yes.
And then, crucially, the climax of the event, the giving of the gifts.
The gifts were meticulously calibrated. The seating arrangement inside the longhouse and the order and value of the gifts distributed were exact physical representations of the social hierarchy.
So a commoner wouldn't get the same gift as a visiting chief.
Exactly. A commoner or a lower-ranking guest might receive food, wooden bowls, or basic tools. But a visiting high chief, a rival, would receive massive amounts of wealth.
Like what?
Canoes, beautifully carved, curved bentwood boxes, rare coppers, and later, during the colonial trade era, huge stacks of manufactured Hudson's Bay blankets.
I want to stop and push back on this for a second.
Okay.
Because practically speaking, this is where the system seems like it should just collapse. If I am a chief, and I have spent 3 years accumulating a massive surplus of dried salmon, trading for canoes, and commissioning carvers, why on earth would I give it all to my political rivals?
It seems counterproductive, right?
Doesn't that just make me poorer and them richer?
Yeah.
How does this not lead to economic ruin?
Because you have to rethink what you are buying. You aren't losing wealth, you are converting it. The guests weren't just there to enjoy a free feast and leave with the canoe.
They weren't.
No, they were there to work.
Work. By eating.
By witnessing. Their job, their legal obligation by accepting the invitation and the food, was to witness the claim being made by the host.
Whoa, okay.
When the host says, "I am taking the name and the fishing rights of my late uncle," the guests, by accepting the gifts, are legally validating that claim.
They are being paid to agree.
They are accepting a strict payment to carry the memory of that transaction home to their own villages and vouch for its legitimacy in the future.
It's a banking system. It functions simultaneously as a public record office and a financial institution.
Precisely. In a society without a written language, without paper ledgers, human memory is the ledger.
But human memory is fallible, and people are selfish.
So, how do you ensure they remember your claim and support it? You pay them. And you pay them so lavishly that they cannot possibly deny it without looking incredibly foolish or dishonorable.
And a gift accepted at a potlatch didn't just buy a memory. It created a strict legal and social obligation to reciprocate.
That is the core mechanism of the economy. If I give you, a rival chief, 50 blankets and a canoe at my potlatch, I am not just giving you free stuff. I am indebting you.
I owe you now.
You are now legally and socially obligated to invite me to your next potlatch and return the favor. And to maintain your own status, you can't just give me back 50 blankets.
Let me guess, I have to give back more.
You have to give me back 60. You have to repay the gift with interest.
Okay, because what they are essentially doing is solving the fundamental problem of a hunter-gatherer surplus. They are converting a perishable surplus into durable social capital.
Exactly. Let's look at the physics of it. You cannot keep a dried salmon for a decade.
No, it will eventually mold, get eaten by insects, or rot.
You can't hoard it forever.
But if you host a potlatch and feed 1,000 dried salmon to your guests and give away hundreds of baskets of berries, you have transformed those perishable calories into standing, reputation, and a dense, interlocking web of societal obligation.
You no longer have the fish, but you have the guaranteed future support of your neighbors.
You have invested your wealth into the social fabric.
It is an incredibly elegant, sophisticated solution to the problem of a localized, perishable surplus. You bank your wealth in other people.
It is the ultimate gift and reputation economy. In this society, the sources emphasize, hoarding wasn't just seen as greedy or selfish. It was considered a pathetic failure of nerve.
If you were sitting on a pile of wealth, if your boxes were full of blankets and your rafters were sagging with salmon, but you weren't potlatching,
You're basically admitting you didn't have the social power, the confidence, or the political ambition to invest that wealth in your community and your rivals.
you were economically stagnant. To be great, you had to keep the wealth moving. You had to empty the boxes.
And the stakes of this competition, this constant push to give away more than your rival, could get astronomically high. Which brings us to the ultimate wealth object in this economy.
Coppers.
I was absolutely fascinated by the coppers in the sources. What exactly are they?
Coppers are large physical objects. They are shield-shaped sheets of beaten, hammered copper.
Like actual raw copper?
Yes, they are usually flared out at the top, and the lower half is divided by a raised, T-shaped ridge that is pounded right into the metal. They might be 2 or 3 feet tall.
And they're decorated, right?
And the top half was often intricately painted or engraved with the crests of the owner, like a bear or a raven.
But they weren't just chunks of precious metal used like giant coins. They were treated almost like living entities.
They were. Coppers had their own distinct names. They had complex biographies.
Do you mean an example of how that worked?
A copper might be named Making the House Empty of Blankets, or All Other Coppers Are Ashamed to Look at It.
Those are intimidating names.
And much like a famous painting or a crown jewel, a copper had a meticulously documented history of exactly who had owned it in the past and at what specific potlatches it had been transferred.
And here's the crucial economic rule of the copper. Every time it changed hands at a potlatch, its value grew.
Because to buy it from a rival, you had to pay more than they paid for it.
Exactly. So a single, highly famous copper with a long, prestigious lineage could be valued at the equivalent of thousands of Hudson's Bay blankets, dozens of canoes, and massive amounts of food.
It represented the distilled, accumulated wealth of generations of potlatching.
Which brings us to the ultimate, most dramatic power move in this entire system, the destruction of wealth.
Oh, this is intense.
If publicly giving wealth away proved your high status, what did destroying it prove?
It proved absolute untouchable supremacy. It was an act of economic warfare.
Let's set the scene. In the most dramatic, high-stakes registers of the potlatch, a chief who was locked in a bitter rivalry for a specific title might bring out a famous copper. And instead of giving it away,
He breaks it.
he would literally take a chisel and break a piece off the top of the copper.
He might then hand that broken piece to his rival.
Or, as the ultimate flex, he might throw the broken piece or the entire copper straight into the central fire of the longhouse.
Or paddle out and drop it into the deep ocean.
What is the psychological message there?
The message is, I am so wealthy, my surplus is so vast, that I can take a fortune that took generations to build, and I can destroy it, and it doesn't even dent my standing.
I don't even feel it.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how this functioned as a calculated, entirely nonviolent weapon. It was a high-stakes tool for social status that replaced physical warfare.
Think about the mechanics of the challenge. If a chief broke a copper and handed the piece to a rival, that rival was now legally and socially trapped.
They were obligated to take their own copper, one of equal or greater value, break it, and return both pieces.
And if they couldn't afford to do that, or if they refused,
they were publicly completely humiliated. Their reputation, which, remember, is their only true bank account, their only ledger, was bankrupted.
Their claim to the title was destroyed without a single arrow being fired.
It's just a brilliant system.
Now, there is an important piece of contested history here that our sources spent a lot of time unpacking. We have to ask, was this intense, highly destructive, high-stakes competition always the norm?
Or did it mutate and change over time?
Right.
This is a major, vibrant area of modern scholarly debate. We have to look at what happened when the maritime fur trade began in the late 1700s and early 1800s.
When the European and American ships arrived looking for sea otter pelts.
Yes, and they flooded the coast with entirely new forms of wealth.
They brought iron tools, which suddenly made falling cedar and carving poles exponentially faster. But, more importantly, they brought the Hudson's Bay blanket.
The Hudson's Bay blanket, specifically the wool point blanket, essentially became a standardized, highly liquid fiat currency on the coast.
Because you could easily stack them, transport them, and count them.
Suddenly, a chief didn't have to rely just on fishing and carving to generate wealth. He could trade pelts for hundreds or thousands of blankets almost overnight.
And simultaneously, and this is the tragic catalyst, the arrival of those ships brought catastrophic introduced diseases. The sources specifically point to the 1862 smallpox epidemic.
The demographic collapse is hard to overstate. Some coastal communities suffered mortality rates of 60, 70, even 80% within a matter of months.
Entire villages were wiped out.
It was devastating.
So if we look at the socioeconomic math of this, you suddenly have a situation with massive amounts of new, highly liquid wealth entering the system via the blanket trade. But you have vastly fewer people alive.
Which means you have empty hereditary seats. Higher-ranking chiefs died, leaving a vacuum of leadership.
And you had lower-ranking individuals who suddenly possessed massive stacks of blankets, deciding to make a play for those suddenly empty prestigious titles.
It's an inflationary spiral.
Exactly. Many historians and anthropologists argue that this specific traumatic historical moment, the influx of colonial wealth, combined with the vacuum of leadership caused by disease, inflated the potlatch.
Right, into the hyper-competitive, deeply destructive spectacle that was recorded by early European observers.
So the practice of potlatching, the philosophy of giving to build status, is ancient and pre-contact.
But the sheer scale of the wealth destruction, the literal burning of thousands of blankets, and the constant breaking of coppers we see in the late 19th century might have been an extreme response to the massive disruption of colonialism.
It was a system trying to rebalance itself in the wake of an apocalypse.
The rules were the same, but the stakes in the currency had been wildly distorted. It's an ongoing discussion, not a fully settled fact, but it provides crucial context.
And navigating that complex history brings us to a transition we have to make. We have to look at the moral tension at the very heart of this deep dive.
Because if we are looking at the whole ledger, we have to practice holding two deeply contrasting truths at once.
The exact same salmon abundance, the exact same predictable surplus that funded the beautiful art, the rich communal prosperity, and the elegant potlatch banking system, also funded one of the most rigidly ranked, highly stratified societies among non-state peoples anywhere on Earth.
It is a difficult truth, but an essential one. We often have a romanticized notion that abundance automatically guarantees equality.
But historically, a massive, localized, defendable surplus often guarantees the exact opposite. It creates classes.
Let's look closely at the class system on the Northwest Coast. We are not talking about egalitarian nomadic bands where everyone shared everything equally around a campfire.
No, this was a society strictly separated into three distinct tiers. You had the hereditary nobles, the chiefs, and the title holders who owned the resources.
You had the commoners, who were free but lacked access to the high titles.
And at the bottom, you had a significant population of slaves.
And we need to handle this material soberly, objectively, and respectfully, recognizing the weight of the history. Slavery was a deeply entrenched foundational economic reality on the Northwest coast prior to European contact.
How did someone become enslaved in this system? It wasn't based on race, like the transatlantic slave trade.
No, it was based on warfare and capture. The people enslaved were captives taken in war and highly organized coastal raids.
The sources specifically note that the Tlingit and Haida, for example, were renowned and feared as maritime raiders.
They would launch fleets of those massive cedar canoes, travel vast distances down the coast, sometimes hundreds of miles, specifically to strike enemy villages, take captives, and plunder wealth.
And crucially, the sources point out that this status was hereditary.
Yes. If you were captured in a raid, you were enslaved, and any children you had while enslaved were born into slavery.
You were trapped in a permanent underclass.
I was trying to conceptualize what it actually meant to be a slave in this specific culture. Because in a society where everything, your fishing rights, your house, your legal protections, is tied to your crests and your lineage, what happens when you are ripped away from that?
You become legally invisible. That is the true terror of Northwest Coast slavery. It was a state of absolute kinlessness.
In a society where your lineage and your family connections were the only things that gave you a recognized legal identity and physical protection, an enslaved person had none of that.
They were property.
They did the grueling labor, paddling canoes, hauling wood, processing salmon, so the nobility had the free time to engage in the potlatch and the arts.
The demographic scale is sobering. Modern scholarly estimates, drawn from rigorous analysis of early historical observations and later archaeological and economic reconstruction, suggest the enslaved population was substantial.
The estimates range from roughly 10% of the population to as high as 25 to 33% in some specific communities and time periods.
That means up to a third of the population in some villages was unfree property.
It's important to emphasize that these are scholarly ranges, not precise census figures, but they unequivocally point to a society where a massive portion of the human capital was unfree.
And this inevitably, inextricably intersected with the potlatch economy. Slaves were not just labor. They were considered a highly valuable, highly visible form of wealth.
The sources mention that at a major potlatch, a host chief might publicly free a slave.
Yes. Freeing a slave during a potlatch was a massive demonstration of magnanimity. It was a dramatic flourish that proved your wealth.
I am so rich I can afford to let this valuable property walk away, and it created an immense social debt.
But there is also the darker side of the historical record, a deeply contested point in our sources. The record suggests that slaves were sometimes killed as part of the wealth destruction we discussed earlier.
According to those accounts, just as a chief might break a copper or burn a stack of blankets to prove his untouchable supremacy, he might have a slave killed.
It was the ultimate brutal demonstration of a chief's absolute power over life and property.
Our sources explicitly point out the nuances and the caution we need to exercise here. Modern scholarship absolutely affirms the centrality of slavery to these economies. There is no debate there.
But the frequency, the scale, and the framing of slave killing at potlatches is heavily entangled with the accounts written by missionaries and colonial agents.
Which is a crucial point of historical literacy. When we read a historical source, we must constantly ask, what was the author's incentive?
Where missionaries and government agents in the late 19th century had very strong political and religious incentives to dramatize, sensationalize, and perhaps inflate the savagery of indigenous practices.
Portraying the potlatch as a frequent, bloodthirsty, murderous event played perfectly to Victorian sensibilities.
It made it much easier, morally and legally, to justify stepping in and outlawing the entire cultural system.
So while the harsh pre-contact reality of slavery is unquestioned, the specific sensationalized details of how it was weaponized in the potlatch remain an open, highly contested question among historians today.
When you look at this ledger, you see two things that seem entirely at odds. We have this incredible ledger of artistic abundance, communal prosperity, and generosity on one side.
And on the very same ledger, we have a society where warfare for captives was normalized, and a quarter of the population might be slaves.
You can't separate the two. The exact same massive run of sockeye salmon bought the free time for the master carver to make a transformation mask, and it bought the free time for the warrior to launch a slave raid.
It is the eternal, uncomfortable question of human economics. When a society manages to create far more energy and resources than it needs to simply survive, who gets to decide how that massive surplus is spent?
And who is forced to bear the cost of that decision.
Which brings us directly to the moment when a completely different society with a completely different economic philosophy arrived on the coast and decided to answer that question for them.
Let's look at the ban. Because there's a profound, almost tragic irony in the colonial assimilation policies that followed.
The irony is that the modern Canadian state looked at the potlatch, the exact finely tuned mechanism that these indigenous societies had used for centuries to distribute wealth, bind communities together, resolve legal disputes, and prevent catastrophic, permanent hoarding.
And they decided it was a dangerous criminal act that had to be eradicated.
In 1884, the Parliament of Canada amended the Indian Act to explicitly outlaw the potlatch. The law officially came into force on January 1st, 1885.
And we have to distinguish very carefully between the indigenous practices themselves and the colonial motives for banning them. Why did a modern state government care so deeply about a feast where people gave away blankets?
Because it wasn't just a feast, it was an opposing economic philosophy.
To the Indian agents and the missionaries tasked with the project of colonial assimilation, the potlatch represented everything they were actively trying to destroy.
They viewed the act of gathering wealth just to give it away, or worse, to destroy it, as inherently wasteful and irrational.
Their entire European worldview, their entire legal and moral framework, was based on the accumulation and protection of private property.
The colonial goal was to turn indigenous people into settled, individual, Christian, European-style farmers and wage laborers.
They wanted them to earn money, save that money in a literal colonial bank, buy a small individual plot of land, and act like proper capitalists.
Exactly. And the potlatch was the primary obstacle to that goal. The potlatch kept people communal.
It required intense mobility, as large groups traveled long distances to attend feasts, which meant they weren't staying on the newly created reserves.
Furthermore, the potlatch validated and empowered the authority of the traditional hereditary chiefs, which directly undermined the authority of the colonial government and its appointed agents.
So outlawing the potlatch wasn't just banning a party. It was an act of economic and legal warfare. It was effectively outlawing their constitution.
The state was attempting to dismantle their legal system, their banking system, their property rights, and their social safety net all in one stroke.
It was a calculated attempt to break the engine of the society.
It's worth noting a jurisdictional difference that our sources highlight. On the United States side, in the Alaskan territories, there was intense, sustained pressure from missionaries and the federal government to assimilate.
They strongly discouraged the potlatch and often suppressed it through soft power.
But the hard criminal statute, the actual federal law putting people in state prison for the act of giving away a blanket, was a distinctly Canadian story.
And we must note that enforcement of the Canadian ban was patchy and inconsistent for decades. Many communities simply refused to comply.
They bravely drove the potlatch underground. They disguised them as Christmas or Thanksgiving dinners, or they held them in incredibly remote, hidden locations far from the eyes of the Indian agents.
But when the state finally decided to truly crack down and make an example, it was devastating.
Which leads us to the most famous and, frankly, heartbreaking enforcement of the ban in the historical record.
It happened in late December 1921. A man named Chief Dan Cranmer of the Nongus people hosted a massive potlatch on Village Island, a remote location in British Columbia.
Cranmer had married the daughter of another powerful chief, and this potlatch was the formal, required validation of the rights and wealth transferring through that marriage.
It was a massive multi-day event. Hundreds of people attended in the dead of winter. The wealth distributed was staggering, combining traditional items with modern trade goods.
He was giving away canoes, Hudson's Bay blankets, pool tables, sewing machines, hundreds of sacks of flour, and significant amounts of cash.
They were conducting traditional dances, validating names, and singing ancestral songs. It was the largest recorded potlatch on the coast at that time.
And the local Indian agent, a man named William Halliday, caught wind of it. Halliday decided this was the moment to definitively break the resistance.
He gathered the provincial police and prosecuted the attendees.
The specifics of the raid and the aftermath are chilling. Roughly 45 people were formally charged with the criminal offense of participating in a potlatch.
About 20 of them, including high-ranking chiefs and respected elders, were convicted and sent to Ocala Prison, a grim, notoriously harsh provincial facility near Vancouver, for terms of 2 or 3 months.
But it's the bargain that Halliday offered that really illustrates the violence of the policy.
It was culturally speaking, a hostage situation.
Exactly. Halliday offered the community a bitter, coercive choice. Surrender your regalia, give up your transformation masks, your coppers, your woven headdresses, your cedar rattles.
The absolute, irreplaceable physical heart of your ceremonial and legal life.
Right. Hand it over, and you can avoid jail time or get shortened sentences for your relatives.
This raises an important question. What happens to a society when the legal and banking system it has relied on for thousands of years is suddenly designated a crime, and the physical records of that system are forcibly hauled away?
They were hauled away like contraband. The authorities confiscated hundreds of priceless sacred items. They were crated up and shipped off to distant museums.
They went to the National Museum in Ottawa, to institutions in the United States, to the British Museum, or were simply sold off to private collectors.
The regalia, which held the legal weight of their specific identities and rights, was treated as confiscated criminal evidence.
It was a deliberate attempt to break the lineage. The logic was brutal but clear. If you take away the masks and the coppers, you take away the physical ability to legally validate the next generation of leadership.
You break the chain of memory.
But the state didn't succeed. The chain wasn't broken. And that leads us to the final section of our sources, the story of Umista and the living present of these cultures.
Because the ban, despite its devastation, did not last forever.
In 1951, the Canadian government engaged in a broad revision of the Indian Act. The political climate had shifted post-World War II, and the anti-potlatch provisions were quietly dropped from the legislation.
After 66 years, the central economic, social, and legal ceremony of the coast was no longer a federal crime.
But the masks and the coppers taken in 1921 were still gone. They were still sitting in glass cases in Ottawa and Toronto.
Fast forward to 1974. A new generation of leadership formed the Umista Cultural Society in Alert Bay, British Columbia.
Their specific mission was to demand that the confiscated 1921 regalia be returned to the people it legally and morally belonged to.
And their condition for the repatriation was crucial. They demanded that the items had to return to the community itself, to be held on their own territory, not just transferred to another provincial museum in a different city.
It took years of intense negotiation. But by 1979 and 1980, the repatriated items, known as the potlatch collection, were finally brought home.
They were housed in specially built new community centers, the Nuumbalese Cultural Center at Cape Mudge and the Umista Cultural Center at Alert Bay.
And the meaning of that word, Umista, is incredibly profound when you understand the context.
It is a perfect poetic linguistic connection to everything we've discussed today. In the Kwakwaka'wakw language, the word Umista originally referred to the return of something precious that had been taken.
Specifically, it referred to a captive, someone taken in those historical slave raids we discussed, finally coming home to their kin.
By applying that specific word to the returned regalia, they are beautifully and powerfully connecting the objects to the people themselves.
The masks are not just wooden artifacts to them. They are living parts of the community that were taken captive by the state and have finally achieved their Umista. They have come home.
And it is so vital to emphasize to you, listening right now, that these cultures are not ruins. We are not talking about ancient vanished history like ancient Rome or Babylon.
These are living, breathing nations today.
There was a massive, vibrant renaissance of these artistic and cultural traditions in the mid to late 20th century.
It was championed by brilliant, determined figures like Mungo Martin, Bill Reed, Robert Davidson, and countless others who ensured the knowledge was passed down.
They studied the old pieces, they interviewed the elders who remember the times before the ban, and they revitalized the carving, the weaving, and the potlatching.
I want to bring you back to that cold open, the memory the compiler shared with us at the very beginning. Remember that carver's studio we walked into?
The smell of the cedar, the sound of the adze.
That carver isn't doing some historical reenactment for tourists. They are practicing a living, unbroken tradition. That line was never severed, despite a 66-year federal ban designed specifically to erase it.
The nations exist. They govern their territories. They weave. They raise poles. They potlatch right now. The adze is still moving.
It is a profound testament to the resilience of a culture deeply rooted in its philosophy of abundance. When your entire society is built on the premise that wealth is found in the social bonds you create, it makes that society incredibly difficult to destroy.
It really does.
So what does this all mean? If we distill the hundreds of pages of sources we've unpacked today, it comes down to this core truth. A massive, localized, highly predictable surplus of Pacific salmon and western red cedar gave these indigenous peoples the ultimate human luxury.
Time. And they use that time to build a breathtaking, monumental art tradition that rivals anything in the world.
But they also used it to build a highly rigid, unequal class hierarchy
Yeah.
supported by enslaved labor.
We have to hold both of those realities. The beauty and the hierarchy are inseparable. They were funded by the exact same salmon.
But most importantly, they built a profoundly different economic system. They built a world where power and status didn't come from what you locked away in a vault. It came from what you freely gave to your community.
It reminds us that surplus, abundance itself, is morally neutral. It doesn't automatically make a society a peaceful utopia, and it doesn't automatically destroy it. It simply funds whatever the society chooses to point it at.
Which is exactly why this history matters so much to us right now in the 21st century. Because we are currently living in a moment where the technology and energy sectors are promising us an impending era of unprecedented AI-driven abundance.
They are promising a post-scarcity world.
If they are right, and we are about to be handed the modern digital equivalent of an unending salmon run, what will we choose to do with that freed-up time?
Will we use it to hoard wealth, isolate ourselves, and build new, rigid hierarchies based on who controls the surplus?
Or could we imagine building a modern version of the potlatch? Could we design a new kind of reputation economy where our social status is measured not by what we accumulate in private, but by how much abundance we can freely and widely share with others?
What will be our generation's copper to break?
Something for you to mull over as we look at what we will carve next with our free time.